Hello. So this is actually going to be in a Hi guys. So this is basically going to be in a live stream setting because for some reason, my camera isn't working on normal things. But anyways, so today I'll be teaching or talking about business law and mm, yeah, basically that. Where am I? Let me see. I can't even. There we go. All right. I'm not gonna cut this video. I'm just gonna upload it as is and put it into a playlist. There's going to be a playlist for lesson 1 and lesson 2. So let's talk about. Okay, so starting with the purpose and ethics of law. This is a rerun also. I recorded this, but then somehow it didn't save, so I'm kind of annoyed at that. But the purpose of ethics and law. So ethics really helps people live together in groups by a moral standard. So ethics really doesn't come into play and laws don't really matter if you're alone. Like think of that. There's that one show, was it The Outcast? No, something about where he was alone on an island and he had to make friends with a volleyball. So in that case, ethics don't really matter for him because it's every man for himself there. He's the only one there. Ethics and laws matter for living in a society. And then laws provide order and predictability for society. So early thinkers would think about, is it a contract? Is it a social rule? Is it rule of conduct? But in general, all agree that the purpose is to ensure orderliness in human activity. So there's in the modern view, there's no strict definition of what law is. It's broad, it's evolving, and it's constantly changing, it's context dependent. There are four main requisites of a legal system. For legal systems to work, it must be one, relatively certain, two, flexible, three, knowable, and four, reasonable. So, thinking about number one, relatively certain, laws have to remain stable so that people can rely on it. And courts are pretty reluctant to overturn established principles. Like in the past, they'll make court judgments and then that'll set precedent for the next few cases. However, law isn't static. For example, Roe v. Wade was overturned in Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization, and typically courts don't want to overturn because they want to maintain the requisite of relative certainty. The second thing is flexibility. So laws have to change as society develops because society will change. It's driven by changes in science and technology, business practices, social values. Some examples would be AI regulation and cryptocurrency and evolving business models. In the past, we didn't have AI, so there was no laws on that. So, because now there is AI, we really have to adapt and change, and there must be flexibility within the law to create new laws and work around. The third thing is knowability. Obviously, citizens want to obey the law, and if you want to obey the law, you need to know what the law is, so you need to be able to know it. And then laws must be published and accessible. Lawyers won't know what all the laws are, but they need to be accessible so that they can advise clients with confidence. And the fourth thing is it needs to be relatively reasonable. So people obey laws as long as the majority think that it's fair and just. And there are many different ways of classifying law or of studying law. So you could study it by subject matter, which are, you could think about it like studying agency, torts, contracts, criminal law, intellectual property law. There's a lot. And then there's also federal versus state. That's another classification. A lot of laws are state level. And then the third one is common law versus statutory law, which I actually have a video on that already, which it's a pretty big classification where common law is judge made and thinking about based on precedent and different cases, and they're unwritten laws. And the statutory law is created by legislatures. They're written codified statutes. And then another thing is civil versus criminal law. This one's also a pretty big one where civil law is between private parties. So think individual suing another individual. And then criminal law is like between governments. So the state and the individual the government will not sue the individual, but it is between them two. So the punishment typically, if you think about punishment, so the difference, civil law really, the punishment's mainly about money, damages and fines, stuff like that. And then in criminal law, you're losing liberty, losing freedom in terms of imprisonment. Of course, there are fines as well. So there's in criminal law, you'll see the difference between felony and misdemeanor, where a felony is a more serious crime. And so, since this is a business law lesson, we'll be talking about laws in business strategy. So there's lots of business strategies. So one of them is avoidance, completely avoiding the law, which is illegal. You'll exploit the legal gaps and actually ignore the law when enforcement is pretty weak. So thinking about Uber, Uber is so big right now. Technically, Uber did something illegal, like they weren't supposed to operate, but because they grew so fast, people were pretty much dependent on Uber that the government can't move Uber out of the state because then people would not be happy with that. So, avoidance. This is very risky though. And then the second thing is compliance. That's another legal strategy is to just comply with the law, actively follow the law to avoid penalties. So, think about Forever 21. Forever 21, they sell clothing items that look like other brands, but they design them so close to the line without a copyright violation. So, edging so close to the line without actually crossing it. And then another thing is prevention. You can build good faith compliance programs for employees, for example, to reduce the risk of litigation. And then another business strategy within the law is value creation. You can use the law to actually gain advantage. So, thinking about Disney IP rights. Disney owns like Mickey Mouse and stuff like that, and they own that. Like, so trademarking, patents, that all creates value for the business. And then lastly, transformation. So you can actually use the law to create new business models. So thinking about Qualcomm, Qualcomm now licenses technology, whereas in the past they used to actually sell physical things instead of doing the licensing. And then another part of law is like the intersection between law, justice, ethics, morals, all of that, right? So the veil of ignorance is you would want to create rules as if you don't know who the laws are for in society, and it ensures fairness. So looking at laws versus ethics, their laws are not always ethical and ethics are not always laws. For example, speeding is illegal, but it's not always unethical. So there is a discrepancy between the standards between law and ethics. So some laws may be held at a higher standard, whereas some ethics may be hard at a higher standard. There's like a discrepancy there. And also in like minors contracts, technically, if you're a minor, you can say you'll do something, but then not do it. And technically, that's okay because you're a minor. It's not ethical, but practically, it's okay due to the law. So, how do cases really work? You have a plaintiff, you have a defendant. The plaintiff is the one suing, the defendant is the one defending. And so the jury will decide the questions of the fact, whether it really happened. So they will give you all the evidence, and then the jury will see, is did it happen? They'll decide if the evidence is substantial enough. And then the judge will decide the question of the law. What does the law say? And so the judge can actually dismiss the case before going to trial if the facts are pretty clear on who's right and who's wrong. And so that's called a summary judgment. An example case that I want to finish off with is Padias versus Mayers, which really goes into thinking about ethics and law as a whole. So here the facts are you have this drunk driver that killed this guy. And then he has two friends in the back seat, right? So the friends in the car didn't help the victim. So the issue here is can passengers be held liable for failing to act for negligence? So technically, the people in the back seat were not the ones driving the car, but the driver caused the accident. So the court actually ruled that the passengers should share liability because they were aware of the danger. They knew that the guy was drunk driving and they failed to intervene. So there's that. He wasn't also, the people in the back seat were not innocent bystanders. So there's also that. And they made many phone calls, right? But not phone calls to the cops, no one to EMS, no emergency services were called at all. So really, they deemed that negligence. So the lesson here in this case is that legal responsibility can actually extend past the direct action, like past the people that are actually like driving the car to negligence of failure to act. So we'll be exploring more of that later. And yeah, that's it for lesson one.